Welcome to D-League, first episode of our game development podcast, brought to you by Jan and Bilal. But today we're going to talk about who and why people develop games and the different approaches behind game development. But first, let's introduce ourselves. Bilal, go ahead.
Hey guys, I'm Bilal and basically I've been programming for about 9 years now, and I've been a game developer for about 4 years, and I mainly use Unity and talk about all kinds of different things you can do with game development and try my best to make it easier here on Zenfinity.net.
And for me, my name is Jan Openkowski. I'm from Germany, and I'm a competitive gamer, or I've been into competitive gaming since 12 years now, at least. I've played RTS games like StarCraft. Currently, I'm more the fighting game player, so I know all the things about the current esport games. Trying games like Dota 2 as well. So I've always looked on the esport scene. So I'll give a background on the esport development since the 90s and the 2000s and how it's today. And so let's get to our first topic: why people actually develop games. Bilal, what's your point on this?
Yeah, so I think when you talk about like why people are developing games, it's actually a really important fundamental to understand. And I think, at least for me, when you get into developing a game, you can forget about the whole purpose of why you're doing it, and that can kind of ruin motivation and actual like interest in developing what you're developing. So I think, like I said, it's important to understand the fundamentals that when you're making a game, I think the very most important thing is that in the end it's fun. And I think that depending on which kind of game you're making, things that really contribute to the fun are just about everything, but what I think is most important are things like balance and responsiveness and kind of hitting that kind of look or feel of the game that you want it to be like. But I think we're mostly going to be talking about things like balance, because if your game is not balanced, then everybody can just play in a certain way that maybe you didn't determine it for play. But balance really will drive that factor of how people are going to play your game, since if nobody wants to use something underpowered, and not too many people would want to use something overpowered unless they play the game only for a short time and decide to quit because of how unbalanced it is.
Exactly. If the game is not fun, I mean, if the game looks really beautiful, but it plays very badly, like maybe you don't have a chance to win if you pick that character, or you don't have a chance to, like, if the game is really unbalanced, you're at a disadvantage, then you will probably have less fun. It's going to be more challenging, but, well, it's not a good game design, right? But
Yeah.
I think why, like you said, my opinion also is that people start developing games because it's fun. Of course, it depends on what size the game is going to be. But for me, I think that people, that they why they start developing, why somebody or some company starts developing a game or a series, is because people are interested in trying that out. Maybe like a new genre popped up because people tried out new things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
somebody has an idea, or a group of people has the idea of doing something that's fun to play, that they want to have realized.
Yeah,
So,
I would totally agree with that.
and but I think why people develop games, well, there are kind of like two different reasons, right? Like, first, of course, like we said, fun or interest.
Yeah.
But then on the other side, it's also about money, because the developer is investing time. So, of course, if it's a side project and you have your job daily job, so you're just doing it on the side, and you don't need the game to be successful to kind of survive or to pay the bill, then money is not such a big factor. But if you want to do it professionally, then I think money is also a factor, why you're actually developing a game.
Yeah, I would think so too, simply for the fact that if you're developing a game and you don't expect to make any money out of it, it can be difficult to stay consistent with that sort of thing because you can spend lots and lots of time on something, but in the end, the money that you gain back from something will help you save more time in the future. For example, if you wanted to make a game after your first game, or maybe even use the same intellectual property, um, then you'll save a lot of time from trying to do everything on your own. If you have the money to, pay in the future for developing your game in many different ways, even social media marketing, just developers, artists, and just about any job, even in your real life, where maybe you hire somebody to do your laundry or something like that. Yeah, that's my take on money. I think from making a game where you can't always just make whatever is in your head. Sometimes you need to monetize it in different ways because we don't have unlimited time in the world.
Yeah, exactly. You always need some kind of revenue from, well, not always, but mostly you need some kind of revenue. And if you if you have like your first game, then it does not need to be the biggest success if you're a new developer, I think. But if you have your brand on the market and people played the game and they enjoyed the game, so they are looking forward to the sequel, then maybe like the first game is not uh, well for you, for the reason why you develop games. It's fun and interesting, and you learn a lot of new stuff. Uh, and it's not the most successful revenue wise, but then the sequel might be actually much more successful concerning the money aspect, I think.
Yeah, that's very true. Depends on, although as an indie game developer, you really have to experiment and find out if something's good or not. Uh, so so yeah, I mean, sometimes there'll be a sequel, sometimes there won't, and that's just the reality of it, depending on how successful uh, your first version is. Simply, because as an indie, you're really just experimenting. You can't go into the world and scream, hey everyone, do you think this game is going to be cool? I mean, yeah, they might say yes, they might say no, but most people won't say anything, and in the end, it'll still be based on if people are actually going to buy it, because somebody might say yes, yes, I'll buy it, and then not buy it. And let me give like one quick example of that. Actually, I remember back when Greenlight was still running. It's not running anymore. We have Steam Direct now. But when Steam Greenlight was running and people had the option of voting yes for the game, it was actually not just voting yes as in I want the game to be on Steam. It was voting yes as in yes, I do want to buy this game once it comes out on Steam. And I mean, like, you can probably make a guess of the percentage of how many people actually do buy the games when they say yes, they'll buy them. Because I mean, if you say yes and then have to wait so long, then that adds another layer of a percentage of customers that you're going to lose simply for the fact that your game is not available for purchase once they answered yes, I do want to buy it.
Yeah, pretty much. If you need to wait 1 year or 2 years, then yeah, maybe you're disappointed
Yeah.
about the game after 2 years of waiting. I mean, if you take a look at some Kickstarter games where people were really upset about the end result, then yeah, always a matter of time how fast you release the game. And like you said about indie game devs, I think um, one really has to experiment
Hmm.
well what people actually like to play.
Yeah.
I mean, if you, for me personally, I would have never guessed that a game like Minecraft would be such a huge success, like it became in the end. Because I mean, if, to be honest, like the graphics suck, and you is there actually music? So it's pretty much it's just a sandbox game
Yeah.
with terrible graphics, but people really loved it, and so you can kind of say like it's a low budget 3D game that really exploded like onto the scene and became successful. And why did it become successful? Because it was an experiment, right?
Yeah.
It was not a game where you just move on the surface, but you can also like dig into the world, and you build your own items, and so it's kind of also interesting to for the player to test new stuff. What
Hmm.
can you do in this game? And I think for the developer, it's also the same. That if you want to create a game that's not just well, that's also interesting for the player, not just for you as the game developer as an experience, then you need to try new stuff because you cannot compete with the big studios. They have uh, funding that you won't see in years, probably.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, no matter how successful you are. Um, so to kind of well, of course you can just do a game that's totally similar to an AAA game. Like you could do some random first person shooter like World War II first person shooter. But if it plays like the same like an, a popular FPS series, just with worse graphics and worse gravity or like gameplay, then why would you buy that game?
Yeah.
You need to have something that's actually different that attracts new players, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. And the world, of course, like on that note of making it the same, like if you make a game that's well, if like for example you just copy Call of Duty or some FPS, and it just looks worse or plays worse. Like being honest here, I mean obviously it is technically possible to make a game better than Call of Duty with the exact same mechanics, but as an indie, it's usually unrealistic for that to happen. And so if you were to just make a Call of Duty that looked a bit worse or played a bit worse, then it's hard to say that like nobody will do you the favor of just buying that game. Like they might buy the game and then you'll see reviews like, oh, I was playing this game for like 5 days and then I realized I was playing Call of Duty and I went back to Call of Duty because it played
Yeah.
better. So
Also,
yeah. No, go
al-
ahead.
also the question is, well, because we are talking about why one would like to develop a game.
Yeah.
Why would you develop a game that's already existing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, I
So
would agree.
you could just skip the developing part and well just buy Call of Duty or Medal of Honor or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
unless you and that's why you don't really see somebody just made Call of Duty and it became really successful because typically you won't if you were to just copy a different IP, I mean you wouldn't care about it unless you looked at an IP and you were like, wow, this really is an interesting game, but I feel like they could have done this better, and so then
Yeah,
then
exactly.
you develop a game based around it's like this game but has this mechanic amplified or improved or something like that. That like say if you have a tactical shooter and you think, wow, the tactics in this game are really cool, but I think that I could add on something more interesting, and then you develop that sort of game, for example.
Yeah, or maybe you just don't like the setting. Like you want it to be more futuristic, or maybe imagine something like Counter Strike but medieval,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so you kind of need to have a new take on something. I mean, no game is perfect. There's always something you can improve.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
there's always some reason to develop a game that's either something completely new or something that's similar to a different game, but just like better in one point or another.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
All right, then let's move on. Now that we talked about why people develop games, let's talk about who actually is developing games. I mean, we already talked about, or well, we mentioned independent game developers and triple A games, which will be developed by well today big game studios that have multiple hundreds of employees that just do graphics or engine stuff or character voices. So there are, well, today there are so many different tasks. So let's talk about who is actually behind the games, and let's start with indie game developers, so independent game developers, um, which is kind of a big group today, I think.
Hmm.
Like the
Yeah,
indie games have become quite popular and also quite successful
yeah,
through platforms like Steam, Greenlight, or well, different own platforms. Maybe they sell on their own homepage, um, like the keys or the game for direct download, or you have
hmm,
like the bundles, the game bundle pages to get more
yeah,
uh, attention. And so I think today, like the indie game developers are kind of people that can do or mostly do everything from the graphics to the sounds to the music. Um, it's a jack of all trades game developer because he needs to do more tasks than in the big studio, right? You need to think about the story,
yeah,
about the gameplay,
yeah.
and so I I think that the indie game developer is probably somebody that turned well, gamer turned developer that really liked games but has his or her own ideas
Yeah,
what to do.
yeah, I would think
Like
I think so for the most part as well. Sorry, go ahead.
no, it's fine. Just
Okay.
I think that like the main point for the indie game developer is more the fun or interest part. Like he or she is interested in, let's say, an RPG. Like you need to have a good story to sell the RPG, right? Because role playing games are all about the story.
Mhm, for sure.
So if you have somebody that's good at writing a story, and then, well, let's take Undertale for example. It's an indie game uh, that really blew up like in the RPG um, community because it tried something new. Like you had different endings, and it was not only about fighting, but also like the characters. You didn't well, like the best ending, you don't fight at all, right? Except for the last boss. Um, so it's a it was a nice new idea on the genre,
Hmm.
and I think that's probably mostly what you kind of get from the indie games, like something really new ideas.
Yeah, I don't know too much about Undertale, but I do know that it's one of those indie games where people are so fascinated by this one special thing that the developer did. Because as indie developers, you usually will have one main focus about a game, and you'll find in general that it's often it's very effective to have one main goal for your game where you think I want this part to be the main focus that is just absolutely amazing, and maybe the game is short, maybe the game is long, maybe the game has all these different problems, like everybody's complaining, oh no, the game is too short. But at least if you get this one thing right, like this one mechanic right, then the game is really great fun, and that's, I think, what is a huge driving factor for it. And
Yeah.
yeah, I would agree on indie developers usually coming from a gaming kind of area. And like, for example, if you like the games that you play and you're fascinated by at the beginning, you might, I mean, for me, like, you get crazy fueled about making those sorts of games. Because I mean, while I have played all kinds of games, like, by far my favorite are RTS games, and I'm always very intrigued by the concept of progression in a competitive game where you can raise your rank or get a lot better. Things like StarCraft and I mean, any RTS. Unfortunately, it's hard to find any, ranked RTS nowadays other than about like StarCraft 2. But if you look at some similar games that have like great progression, like there's a lot of strategy involved in League or Dota or Counter Strike, and while they're not RTS games, they all employ this mechanic of progression and ranking up to a different rank. And I thought that's always been something really fun, that there's a really high skill cap, and you can always be getting better. And so it's always been an interest of mine to work on sort of esport games, simply because of how interested I have been on playing them. and and I think that as a game developer now, that's really what fueled my interest, is just having played them before and having a great time. Because I would even try to, like, I remember when I was just a kid, maybe in like middle school, uh, even developing or even playing things like Minecraft, I would always play them competitively with a bunch of friends. So like getting the most kills, or building the biggest bases, or getting the most resources, etc. So I think I would totally agree with indie game developers, like mostly being gamers who have decided, wow, this stuff is so cool. I want to make my own take on this, and then see how I can make it better and share my creativity with the community.
Yeah. So what I just thought about was that if you compare like today to the game industry of the 90s, when
Mm-hmm.
it was really, well, compared to today, it was a really small industry. Like the budget for games was nowhere near the budget today. Even if you just take a look at like today legendary games like Doom, like the first Doom
Mm-hmm.
games,
Mm-hmm.
or like the first Command and Conquer games, um, like the games that kind of defined genre, like first person shooters, RTS, or like RPGs. Even if you take a look at Final Fantasy, then like the developers were more, well, like the indie game developers today. Like Doom was about, well, more the technology, right? Like 3D, well, 2.5D graphics.
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted to push like the graphics. It's like
Yeah.
who knows? The story was, well, kind of non-existent, right? You were just some space marine walking around, kind of saving Earth by shooting demons.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, so like the graphics were the main selling point. Or for Final Fantasy, it was about the story that was the main selling point. So the developers of the past, they tried something new that just kind of clicked with the user, and that's why these games define genre, or well, like why they actually attained the status they have today, I think. So now that we talked about indie game developing, let's take a look at, well, the gaming industry and people that, or game developers that do it more professionally and in the game development studios, the big game development studios. What do you think? What's the structure in the big studios like?
Yeah, I mean, with all these big games where you have hundreds of developers, not developers in the sense of programmers, but just any field. Um, I think that everybody is interested in the games that they're making, but I don't think that they would have. I don't think that people have the same exact spark as an indie developer might have, because if you think about, there are some indie developers that you can find online that are just crazy excited about the thing they're working on, and they might even be a one-man team because they're so like crazy interested that just their talent alone can drive something like that. And there's an example, actually, the developer for Pinstripe. Like you can find him on the Made with Unity site and all that sort of stuff. He has a lot of videos where he's talking about how interested he was in the game, and he was developing this game alone, I believe. But if you look at it, it actually looks like a very high quality game, a very interesting story that the guy is trying to tell. Um, but on that note, I think that it is really. I think that there's a bit of a divide in the interest, and I think that's natural, since if you have hundreds of developers, not everybody thinks alike, and I mean a lot of those developers could just be trying to get somewhere in the games industry. So while you might be interested to work on something, it's not necessarily the choice that you had laid out yourself, since obviously you did not make. Most people who are working on a game did not make their company, or they did not make their they didn't decide on which game they're going to make. While there are like AAA companies that are smaller teams and they are mostly interested in it, I think that as the number of people on a team grows, the higher chance that there will be people that are not crazy about what they're working on, but maybe they find the technology cool, or they find what they're going to be doing with that game cool, or just maybe they just want to share their creativity or work with other people, or help where they can to make a game interesting. So obviously it varies. There can be people who are just as interested as indie developers, or people who are completely uninterested in what they're doing. there's a wide spectrum, I think, in AAA that's much wider than in indie, simply because AAA is where there's more money, and more certainty, whereas indie you have to be accepting of the risk and uncertainty you get when you develop whatever it is that you want to, because you have to take the industry and the market out for account. Whereas AAA's, they don't need to do it as much. Their publisher or their company overhead will determine where that game is going to be sold, and all the marketing, and they can kind of guarantee, yeah, it's going to be sold a lot, even if it's not necessarily the greatest game. But if it's interesting enough, then yeah, they typically will sell the game, and it typically will return enough money to pay everyone, unless they make a big mistake. But yeah, I think that's my opinion for the most part on like who's developing in AAA. Just people who, yeah, and I think it can be also anybody interested in getting a chance like a certain chance in game development, because maybe you want to build a credential, or maybe you want to say, yeah, I did work on this game, and maybe you want to prove to yourself that yes, I can make some awesome stuff and get it out there, and people will love it. I think it's definitely easier to do if you're going to be working at a AAA studio. The difficult part is just landing a job there, because game development has a lot more developers than it does have jobs. So that's just something to take into account.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you need to be lucky, and then as well you also need to get into a position where you can actually decide some stuff, like the design maybe, or maybe like if you're a sound designer, like the music or the sounds, how you want to have them turn out in the end. I think like you said, In AAA studios, you have more certainty. Like you have a stable income, or you're hired for, well, at least the whole project. If you don't
Yeah.
do a really bad job, that you're fired. I think, and that well, I mean, if you have a game like sports games, like the new FIFA or uh, NFL Madden, well, where's you cannot be too creative, right? Because it's well, it's a sport game and you have set rules, but well, maybe you need to swallow that pill, uh, so you can just show that you can do well the task you're supposed to do, and then maybe you can find you can work on a more interesting project afterwards.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. Outside of the game industry, you also have jobs that are not that satisfying. So,
Yeah.
like if you just need to like print documents and file them and send them to customers, of course, well, you get paid, but it's probably not the most interesting work. Something like that. I mean, it like the AAA games. It like video games have really become an industry that's growing from year to year.
Yeah.
And in the big companies, well, in the indie game developers, like if you have a small company, let's say 5 guys, then you have people that do several tasks. But in the game development, in the big studios, you have guys that only do sounds, or you have like through maybe a team that only does the background music. Um, or well, you have a few guys that do the marketing, that just create, like maybe you have 5 guys that create the marketing material, and then you have 5 guys that actually do the marketing. So as a developer, if you're a programmer, then you just focus on programming, right? So well, if everyone would do everything, then you would have complete chaos. So
Yep.
I think it's that you have more structure is a good thing,
Yeah.
but everything has pros and cons. If you want to be really creative, then maybe um, big studios are not the best decision. Because well, like you have people that say, yeah, I want to create games, I want to develop games, and I want to like bring my own ideas to life. Like they want to create the game they always wanted to create. But then when you start at a AAA studio, or like a bigger game studio, not doesn't even need to be AAA games, then you might be disappointed because okay, you need to create that one thing, or maybe you just need to create characters and they already set, like the design, so you just need to model them so they look like the outline that was handed to you. So you don't really well, you wanted to be creative, but you can't. But well, at least you get paid, right? I mean, for indie game developers, if you invest too heavily into the game, and you don't have a backup plan, and the game bombs, like you think, okay, it's gonna sell 5,000 pieces, and that's gonna be all right. Then I can live for like 3 months, so I can invest more money. But then in the end, you don't have that turnout because maybe you oversaw something, or the game is too buggy, or you cannot make it in time, in the time frame you wanted. Then it's a much bigger risk, right? So as an indie game developer, it's kind of like entrepreneurship. If you start a company, but it's a higher risk, but you can also have a higher reward. At the AAA company, it's a lower risk and a lower reward probably, except if
Yeah.
you if you climb the ranks in the company and then maybe you become the main game designer, the head game designer, then yeah, you can do whatever you want and you're paid well.
Yeah.
Uh, then you're living the dream, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Because you got big bucks to spend um,
Yeah.
without much risk.
Actually, on that note, like we actually just talked about Minecraft, and I mean, if you think about it, like the code in Minecraft was, absolutely awful. If you heard, if you had to listen to anybody, I mean, I don't know what it looks like now, considering we have more lead programmers and the team is a lot bigger, but back then, like this guy who's a self-taught programmer, he's not even really considering he's considered a game developer at the time. He's like working a job and he he learns Java of all of all languages to make a game in, and just programs this game that, like we said, it's not looking great, but what's really exciting about it is how consistent it is. So everything consistently looks the same, and the concept is consistently do whatever you want to, within the boundaries of the game, and like look at, he didn't have a job at a game developing company, and now he's crazy rich just because he made this simple game all on its own, and it doesn't matter what technology he used, it doesn't matter how he programmed it. He just on his own made a game and sold it, and people found it interesting enough, and that just blew up like crazy.
Hmm.
Just something to think about. Like if you do indie right, and you get lucky and you do everything else right, then you can you can be a lot more successful than just somebody working a job at a AAA studio.
Hmm. Well, and also you own the intellectual property,
Yes, yeah,
so that's also a pro because you might think uh, you might have a great idea while working at a studio and then it gets produced, but well, it's not your game. You don't own the game, so maybe if you quit the company and it was like your own child, like something you developed
yep,
yourself and you invested a lot, well, tough luck.
yeah.
You cannot create a sequel or something like that without buying the rights to the game.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
even that had value. Even to bring back the example of Minecraft, he sold his IP to Microsoft. Even if you don't care too much about the IP and you just want to sell it, then that's an example that the biggest computer company has now bought this small time self-taught programmer's game. So just something to think about.
Yeah, but it's probably about the IP, right? I mean, they probably could have just taken some developers and well, created it themselves.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
in the end, they chose to buy the IP because million people, a million people were already playing the game.
Yep.
So the brand was already popular and people knew the game. And if you just copied it, then, well, why play the copy if you can play the original?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So then we talked about why develop games, and now we talked about who develops games and well, the pros and cons. So to everyone listening, just think about what you want to do. What's actually really important to you if you want to do your own thing,
Hmm.
or if you just want to experience the game industry. And so then you can well, see or think about which is better for you: indie games, bigger studios. Um, then just make up your mind what's more important. And
Yeah.
so let's come to our last topic for today: the different approaches to game development. What we mean with this is how, well, you and I, or the people listening, would approach the game development process. Like maybe which genre they are interested in, what kind of design they like. Um, for example, for Europeans, well, maybe you like medieval, a medieval setting. So you will probably take European knights, and you would fight in Europe in the medieval time. Um, while then if you compare it to Asia, suddenly you won't have knights, but maybe in Japan, samurai, and a completely different game design, character design. Um, so that's what we want to talk about for a bit. Um, like Bilal, what's your idea about this? Do you think the approaches are very different from area to area or culture to culture?
Yeah, I mean, actually, think about, I mean, how like the big difference in esports even across, here and somewhere like South Korea. Like, the culture is really in South Korea. People are a lot a lot better and a lot more interested in esports simply because the culture is a lot more accepting of video games. Whereas here, in America, which where I'm from, there's like some people are even will be embarrassed about video games, or they'll be like, go stop, get off those games and go get a job or something like that. And people always, instead of viewing it as a hobby, there's always going to be a select group of people who are thinking, oh, you have to be lazy or a loser to play a video game, which is, I mean, obviously it's inaccurate. It's just something for fun. But uh, but I think, yeah, something to look at is the big difference between like how games are played here and in a place like South Korea. There, it's a lot more competitive, I think, in that sort of area. And if we want to talk like more like the concept of the game rather than how they're played, uh, yeah, I'd say, I mean, no matter, like, depending on where you go, like the farther you change between countries, the more different games you'll see, of course, simply because of that sort of culture and how that idea works. I mean, you could just take a look at like games from Nintendo, versus games from like Gearbox or EA. Like there's a very different way that you look at the characters. Like where like commonly in like look at Mass Effect, for example, the main character is a hero, the kind of American hero that you'll see in film or you'll see in games. Here we kind of have that individualistic look at how much cool stuff this main character has gone through, and look at how well he's doing, and he or she, and also look at you get the opportunity to play as this person. Whereas like in Japan, I mean, I feel like there are more games that are very popular that are less focused on how grizzled and cool the main character is. While that kind of thing exists, like I'd say Solid Snake or Ninja Gaiden are kind of like that, but with a I'd say more focus on how fun the game is rather than how grizzled that main character is. But I'm not too well versed on all the games from Japan beyond Nintendo. But I mean, I feel like that's the kind of vibe I get from the difference between here and Japan, for example.
Well, yeah, my opinion on this is that also like the genre are very different, or like the popular genre are very different from area to area, like from country to country as well.
Yeah.
Like in the US and at least Germany, I don't know about the other European countries that much, but for I think here, like strategy games and first-person shooters were really, really popular in the 90s.
Hmm.
Right now, RTS are not that popular anymore. I mean, you have some big RTS games like StarCraft 2 that are still played. Or, I mean, even Dota or League of Legends are kind of RTS games.
Yeah.
Um, at least you have the HUD and the control scheme.
Hmm.
And then you compare it to, for example, Japan, where in the past PCs were pretty much just seen as a platform for porn games. So also you don't have much space in the big cities like Tokyo and Osaka. So people, well, they just bought consoles, or pretty much like even the Nintendo consoles, they were called family computers. So it was more also educational.
Hmm.
So not just playing games like in the West, but they also wanted to have something educational, right?
Yeah.
So that's why, well, first person shooters and RTS are not very popular in Japan, while arcade games, like arcade genre, are still popular, or like the big esport games right now in Japan, like Street Fighter, or like fighting games, Street Fighter, Guilty Gear, the King of Fighters. They all have their like or Tekken. They have like their own world championship series now. Um, while, well, for example, in Europe, fighting games are pretty niche. Of course, people know the genre or the games, but the number of competitive gamers are compared to RTS and FPS really small, I think.
Hmm.
So like you when you develop a game, and the game developer is also influenced by this surrounding, like you and I, we played first person shooters and RTS in our childhood, even though we should probably not have played rated 18 FPS. But they influenced us. Like we wanted to play these games, or we really like the genre. Like, I mean, you said you really like RTS and you want to develop RTS
Yeah.
because you played them in the past. So for if you take a Japanese a Japanese guy in his 20s, then he might say, um, I want to go into game development, but I want to create an RPG, or I want to create a fighting game, or some action game like Metal Gear Solid, something like that, and instead of some game genre that's pretty much PC only. Well, if you count out Halo, for example, for FPS, but like the origins are on the PC. And also you can kind of see, like you talked about Nintendo, and like the philosophy of development is also different. I think instead of trying something completely new, the approach in the past was that they take something and they improve it in several aspects.
Hmm.
Like even if you take Super Mario, I mean, you already had other games where you, well, move around and you pick up items, but Super Mario had really like good controls, and they upgraded the graphics compared to other games, and like the whole, like the whole game was improved. It was something, not something completely new, but it improved on everything that made up the jump and run genre. And then
Yeah.
you have something like also Resident Evil, which well is developed by Capcom. The first game, when was it released? I think 1996. The game, it, you had Alone in the Dark before on PC,
Hmm.
and which had kind of a similar feeling, like you were um, an older man walking around in a possessed mansion with like creatures and demons, and I think you also had a gun and weapons to fight with, and then you had Resident Evil, which also like the first game played in a mansion, but they replaced the creatures with mostly with zombies, and it's more like you can like Resident Evil feels Western, but it has this Japanese development philosophy to take
Mm,
something and then improve the graphics and like the scenario and like the gameplay.
hmm.
It's not something where you say, "Oh, I've never seen that before," but where you say, "Okay, this just makes it perfect."
Yeah, yeah, I
And
see that.
and like even um, if you look at what games you have right now, I mean the Japanese video game industry is kind of in how can I say um, like a bad state because games have become that expensive to develop that and people want to play something new. So well, you cannot perfect something anymore to just sell the game, but people want. Well, you have indie game developers as well to um, so people can play something new, and the costs are so high that well, even the bigger Japanese companies need to try something different because people are tired of playing the same stuff over and over again, and yeah, they kind of can't find their like niche to target because the Japanese market and the Western market is so different. So yeah, I
Hmm.
think that if somebody is interested in developing a game, then also think about who you are developing the game for, who you are targeting, because like I said, Japanese companies mostly focus on the Japanese market, but the Japanese market, it's still a big market, but the games need to be um, kind of be able to be sold internationally because well, as an indie game developer, you don't really care too much about cost because you have a low budget, so it's gonna be a let's say cheap game.
Hmm.
Um, but uh, well, you need to see if it can actually sell in your area. If I would create an RTS game and only sell it in Japan, then it would bomb. It would not sell probably.
Yeah.
But in Europe or in the US, you have people that like the genre already, so they might give it a try. And then you could say, okay, it was not the most successful game, but it was well cost neutral.
Yeah.
Um, do you have anything to add to that? Any like something that people should keep in mind, or that you would like to add to the like the argumentation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would definitely agree with choosing who you're targeting because actually one thing that's important to know is as an indie, you typically your marketing services. I do. I should mention that obviously if you're a one man team, you're going to be doing literally everything, including writing hundreds of emails. So, I mean, your marketing team is you and whatever you can use from just about everywhere. Steam, Kickstarter, your blog, your YouTube channel, all that. I mean, that's your marketing. You're basically going to use a bunch of other companies' willingness to help. So, I mean, you might if you're going to publish on Steam, you probably will get more. And I've mentioned this before. You'll get more attention on Steam than anywhere else So you don't have to worry, a crazy amount about, oh, I need to prep this game for sale in all these different places, especially since you're not going to be doing retail. You don't need to ship your game anywhere. You're going to definitely be doing digital distribution. But with that said, uh, you know, just oftentimes you'll want to niche down. And when you do that, you need to know who you're niching down for. Go on Reddit, go on forums, and find out like what people are playing, what they like about their games. Even send them your game, or give them giveaways, free copies, beta testing, all that, just to see what they think is awesome about your game, even because as an indie, you cannot sell to literally everyone unless this is like a small time project. If you want to make a game that you actually are proud of and people will love, then I definitely recommend going for one of those niches uh, because it's just so much easier, as a one person to say, oh, this is the kind of game I'm making and it's going to be great for people who like this kind of stuff. Like if I'm working on an RTS or something, then I want to say, what is it that has disappointed people about RTS recently? And, I'm not going to name any names, but there a lot of the games that are RTS are right now being released as, either they're okay, or they're unfinished, or or they don't really have anything special to offer. And so, like, if you're going to develop an RTS, you have to make sure, what mechanics is my RTS going to focus on? Because if you look at StarCraft as an esport, they have, build orders are a big thing. Knowing how to respond and scouting to your enemies, that like those are big things. And, just following a strategy in a match that you can change based on what the other guy does. That is, what I believe is probably the most important thing in StarCraft is just having a strategy and then knowing how to change it depending on what the other guy does. Um, and so I'd say, like maybe that's I mean, I wouldn't know for sure, but like maybe that's an example of something that's huge in why people play competitive RTS. Maybe that's something you want to advertise and say, hey guys, uh, I'm sick of only playing StarCraft. I want to play a new RTS, and so I started working on one, and I want to know your input on what you think of as your favorite thing out of StarCraft, or favorite thing out of anything, Universe at War, Supreme Commander, Total Annihilation. What's your favorite part about these games? And they'll tell you all sorts of things, and then it's up to you to like figure out which ones are most important. I need to do some experimentation to figure out what people will actually like, because what people do can oftentimes be very different from what they say. And humans, they're not very it's not deterministic. You cannot predict. You can take guesses, like educated guesses, but you can't know for sure what someone is going to do based on, the past. So experimentation is I should clarify. Based on what they'll say in the past, you can predict and make these educated guesses based on data that you collect. For example, like using Unity Analytics, or asking on Reddit, or having people review your game and test it while it's in or very early development. And I emphasize very early development because if you want to make something successful, you need as soon as you can show people what your game is supposed to be, and you have some art that's like looks good for at least one aspect of the game. You want to start sharing it so that your game can actually be successful, because like I said, the world is not going to do you any favors. You're not going to, just because you feel like you have done a good job, it doesn't mean, and maybe you have, it doesn't mean that, your game is going to uh, be huge and sell everywhere. So,
Hmm.
so I mean, yeah, like I think it's all about niching down, I think, at the beginning, and choosing the
Okay.
scope of the game that you want to make, and
Hmm.
knowing, who you're going to sell to, and what that niche is really interested in. kind of I kind of went a little bit ranty there, but I think those are the main points on that subject.
Okay. So what you're trying to say is that uh, people will not buy the game if they don't know about the game, something like that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
uh, for the most part, I think it's mostly yeah. If they don't know what your game is supposed to be, or if they don't know, you know,
That it exists at all.
yeah, they need to know it exists, and they need to know like what the point of it is, because you can just make a game and say, oh yeah, it's cool, buy it, and like people will say, what? What I don't. What do you do? What do you do in the game? So that sort of thing can of course hinder your marketing and whatnot.
Hmm. All right, then I would say we will wrap it up for today. So we talked about why people develop games, money and interest. Of course, it's always both, kind of, or
Yeah.
different use of both. And we talked about who develops games, who's behind the games, like the indie game developers, the big game studio developers, the tasks, how they split up, and um, like the different structures between, well, let's say, both company types. And then in the end, we also discussed about the different approaches to game development, different cultural approaches, how it influences the genre, well, kind of the decision which genre to develop a game for, how it looks like, the design, etc.
Hmm.
And so I hope our listeners learned a lot today, and feel free to comment on our homepage or on YouTube, depending on where you're listening to the podcast right now.
Hmm.
And so, thank you very much for listening. Do you have any Do you have any final comments, Bilal? Anything you want to tell to to the listeners?
No, I think that wraps it up. But yeah, like you said, I would definitely recommend leaving a comment about what you think about these sort of topics, and if you think we're right or if you think we're wrong, let us know, and we'll give you responses and what we think too.
Exactly. So then, thank you very much for listening once again, and then we will hopefully see you in our next podcast.